So now that the dust has settled on Dustin Poirier versus Islam Makhachev, Islam really solidified himself as a quality, top level champion in the UFC. And there's a lot of talk about what's next for him. Arman Tsarukyan was in the crowd at UFC 302, and a lot of us were sort of expecting a potential face-off. They had a fight before early in Arman's career when he was much younger, like 22 or 23 years old, that went to decision. So Arman has looked spectacular, and he stakes his claim as the top guy at 155. However, Islam did mention in his post-fight speech that he doesn't feel like there's a lot left for him at 55 and he wants to go to 70.
Right.
So obviously you would look to the champion, who's Leon, but Leon's booked. He's got a fight with Belal Muhammad, and we'll have to see how that shakes out. You also have Shavkat Rakhmonov waiting in the wings to fight the winner of that fight. So there's a lot of moving parts, and I know that Islam and Belal have a close relationship. They've trained together and things like that. So if Belal were to defeat Leon, that would throw a wrench into the situation. So I want to get your take on what the next move for Islam Makhachev should be. Should he continue to look at the 170 division, or is it a little bit early as far as the timing to make that jump, and it might be best to stay at 155, beat the guy you took to decision when he was a young man, and really show that not only did you knock off one of the biggest names at 155 in Dustin Poirier, but also you can knock off the most skilled talent that's making their way up the division.
Right, and I love that. And Islam Makhachev, he gets done doing work with Dustin, and then just like all fight fans do at the end of every Saturday night fight on the UFC, we go out and say, all right, what's next? We begin to speculate. And you have some fights that are pretty much solidified. You know who the top contenders are. And then other times it's always just, something random, and things have to play out in the division. People have to, have their fights, and all their ducks have to get in a row. And then the UFC can understand who the top guy is and who should get the next opportunity. In my opinion, Arman solidified that at UFC 300. He showed us that, all right, I am the top contender. And with the layout of the rest of the division, especially the co-main event, the BMF title at 155, that knocked the other big name, Justin Gaethje, out of the ranks, out of the discussion for the next title shot. And it sort of leaves you with nobody else, right? There's tons of great fighters at 155. In my opinion, it's the most stacked division.
Yes.
But Arman sits above everybody. Gamrot's going to probably make it to a title in the next 18 months to 2 years, but he's not there yet. Justin Gaethje and Dustin are both out for right now. They both suffered bad defeats. Dustin's had his last title shot likely. And Beneil Dariush, you start really trying to jog your brain, and you're having a hard time doing that and finding anybody other than Arman Tsarukyan. Yeah. And I love that you brought up Rakhmonov as far as the welterweights go, because Islam Makhachev not only lives in the era of the champ world. Everybody wants to become a champ, and he's even in the division where Conor McGregor sort of started all that off. So it makes the most sense for the 55ers to dare to be great and move up to 70, or if you're a 45er, move up to 55. So I think Islam Makhachev wants to do that, and I think there is a great progression for him at 170. I think all the fights up there are going to be very difficult, but he can be very competitive and even win it. I think he could potentially be the welterweight world champion, but like you said, Rakhmonov has made himself basically the number one contender, and I would assume he'll be the alternate fighter and the guy that weighs in for the Leon versus Belal fight. And so that's why you have to look at timing. Timing is everything in this sport, and just because Islam probably could sit right in a title fight with Leon or Belal, it doesn't make sense to do that and have him jump over Rakhmonov, especially because Rakhmonov would likely be the favorite against Belal or Leon, and I think personally Rakhmonov versus Islam Makhachev would be an even bigger fight than you could make. Yeah, I mean, probably bigger than anything at 155, unless, of course, Conor McGregor is able to beat Michael Chandler in crazy fashion, first-round knockout or something, and then the UFC just throws in their biggest star, their biggest cash cow, to compete against the pound-for-pound number one guy that they have on the roster in Islam Makhachev. So aside from that fight happening, which, we're a few big jumps away from that being a possibility, aside from that, Islam Makhachev's next biggest fight would be Rakhmonov, but because of Rakhmonov's body of work at 170 and Arman's body of work at 155, it leads you to believe that champ status can come for Islam at some point, but I don't think it's next. I think he has a little bit more work to do at 55. And look, after he gets Arman out of the way, it's no longer his job to knock down the top contenders. It's up to the other guys, the top 5, top 6, top 8 guys, to make some waves, make a little run, put a 2-fight win streak together, and then start calling for Islam Makhachev. That'll give you enough time after he goes and tries to go for champ status at 170, and then wait for him to come back to defend his title at 55.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that if we lose Islam to 170 that he'll ever come back. And I think he may end up vacating the belt. He'll obviously want to hold it long enough to solidify himself in the very, very small group of fighters that have become champ. His mentor and very close friend Daniel Cormier is one of them, but there's only a handful. And so I think that Islam, especially now at 32 years old, one thing we know as you grow, especially as you get into your early/mid 30s, you don't get any smaller.
Right.
And Islam is a pretty big 155er. He's a pretty muscular 155er.
He cuts a lot of weight.
Yes, and I know that weight cut really does drain on him a lot. Also, I don't know how much is left for him at 55 after he beats Arman.
Right.
Now, a lot of people have said, Islam Makhachev really hasn't defended against a 155er. He beat Charles Oliveira for the belt in spectacular fashion, but then it was 2 defenses against Volkanovski, who's a 155er, albeit he was the number 1 pound for pound at the time and certainly deserved to challenge for that champ status. However, then you threw Dustin Poirier in there. And
Right.
Dustin Poirier is a name that everybody respects at 55. He's a guy that's been at the top of the heap for a very, very long time.
Right.
So that's a feather in Islam's cap. He knocked off one of the biggest, when Conor McGregor is not competing, Dustin Poirier probably is the biggest name at 155 as far as star power and recognition is concerned.
For sure.
But he's also got the skills, and he showed that against Benoit Saint Denis, and he also showed it against Islam.
True.
His skills weren't quite good enough. But I think he needs one more marquee win at 155 to solidify himself as one of the best 55ers ever. And Arman Tsarukyan's the guy. Arman Tsarukyan is 28, 29 years old. By the time they would get in the cage together, he's very much in his prime right now. He's looking spectacular in fights. He's starting to win a lot of fights by finish, by knockout. He's a dangerous opponent that stylistically matches up well against Islam because he's a spectacular grappler. So for Islam, if he could get that win and he could even finish the guy that he wasn't able to finish earlier in both of their careers, that would stamp his seal of approval to move on up and go to bigger and better things at 170, and probably not come back down again unless a Benoit Saint Denis gets back in the win column and goes on a tear, and everybody wants to see that fight or something of that nature happens. But the reality is the two guys that everybody kind of was hoping to see Islam fight was BSD and Justin Gaethje, and they both suffered setbacks. And then Justin suffered a setback to a guy who's now going back down to 145 because he's got business with Ilia Topuria. So that kind of cleared the deck a little bit and really just leaves Arman as the only one standing. So I think the next fight for Islam Makhachev should be a 155 title defense against Arman Tsarukyan.
I agree.
One, because that's a fight that makes sense. It's a great matchup, and it's one that is going to be a very difficult fight and one that I think the fans and the true purists would like to see. But more importantly than that, it allows 170 to sort of clear the air. It allows Leon versus Belal to happen and see how that shakes out. I'm kind of leaning towards Leon to win that fight. So if I'm right, then Leon maybe jumps in there with Rakhmonov early next year, or maybe even at the end of this year in like December or something like that. Islam likely fights at in Abu Dhabi, which I believe is in October, and then he generally, if history is any indication, he's going to fight in the fall, and then he's going to fight again after Ramadan the following year, which gives Leon a chance to then defend again against Shavkat Rakhmonov
or Belal.
But I'm going to say my leaning is towards Leon, so I'm just going to play with that scenario. So Leon defeats Belal, he fights Rakhmonov. That fight could go either way. Both of them are very skilled. And either way, whoever comes out on top of that fight fights Islam. But let's say it is Rakhmonov. If you could build that fight, Islam Makhachev versus Shavkat Rakhmonov, Islam is the challenger, Shavkat is the champion. You're talking about not just one of the biggest as far as like draws are concerned in UFC history, but one of the most skilled fights between two guys that are so complete. I think the world would love to see that fight. And I think him fighting Arman next and letting the dust settle at 170 could potentially set up for that.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk on that Shavkat Rakhmonov fight a little bit, because when we see Islam in there, even though he is a big 55er, when you wind up taking your shirt off and you're in the octagon squared off with your guy, you don't really see a major size difference with him and other lightweights. We saw a bit of a size difference between him and Volkanovski, but I'd be really interested in seeing Islam's size difference with Rakhmonov. I've seen Rakhmonov in person. He's massive. And I've seen Islam stand next to people people I've met in person, and I don't think that they're very close in height. I think Rachmanov is a sizably bigger guy. I don't think there's any chance in hell he would ever make 155 pounds. He was probably a teenager last time he weighed that much. So I'd like to see Islam go into a fight where he has a size disadvantage and potentially a strength disadvantage, because that's what, I don't like to say that Islam and Khabib and those guys just utilize strength and that's their a way that they beat people. They have really good technique, but when you start to match technique with them, then you have to start to pull deeper into your box of tools, and that's when they start to utilize their strength, and their grappling strength in particular is where they really excel. People that have gone up against the very best Dagestani fighters out there always say it's just a little different than anything you can experience in MMA. There's other guys that are great grapplers, whether they come from Brazil and they're high level, grapplers and jiu-jitsu guys, or whether they come from the All-American circuit from Division I wrestling or even Olympic wrestling. There's guys that are really good, but when it comes to pure MMA, the guys out of Dagestan seem to be doing some things a little bit different, and I think they're very finite and minute details that are getting basically just brushed over because people don't realize what's going on, and you almost can't, and practice for it or anticipate it until you've actually felt it once or twice. And that's why I think Dustin actually had a better chance at beating Islam than he did against Khabib, because he was able to at least understand where they were coming from. And he had a better understanding. Obviously, it wasn't enough, and Islam's still the best lightweight in the world. But I would love to see, if that was negated for him, how much more technique he might start to showcase for us. Because I think if Islam Makhachev goes out there and Rachmanov is stronger than him, he's longer than him, and he's able to get his strikes off, Islam's going to have to dig deep and look for some very interesting calculated entries as far and strikes, as well as takedowns and ability to keep his fighter on the ground. So that's why I really do like that fight, and I'm with you. I think we should wait, kick the can on 170 a little bit for Islam, let Belal and Leon go do their thing, see how that shakes out. Who knows? There might be a rematch that winds up happening. But I think if Rachmanov gets that belt, you are talking about a mega fight. As far as active fighters go, Islam's one of the best. He's also one of the most well-known. And while Rachmanov is sort of like the slightly less known Khamzat Chimaev, he's still very much a vicious killer at 170. He's the number one contender in everybody's mind. Most people think he's the most skilled welterweight in the entire UFC that just hasn't gotten his shot at the belt yet. So I think that fight really does make for something very interesting and a little bit more epic than Islam just jumping in and fighting either Belal or Leon. But, like we were talking about, I think he's got work at 55 that he needs to do. And whether it's Arman and then he moves up to 70, or it's Arman and a couple more while things shake out at 170 and lightweight, it's still up to be determined. I think Islam can make it 155 2 or 3 more times if he has to, but I'm leaning with you that he probably only wants to do it one more time, and then he wants to have that slightly easier weight cut at 170, maybe even put on a little bit of size so he can become a full-fledged welterweight contender and possibly champion, because you don't want to go in with a body that can still make 55. If you go to 70, you kind of have to burn the boats and leave 155 for good, because your body composition is going to change once you move up to 170. You're going to have to eat more. You're going to have to get stronger. You're going to have to hit the weights even more than you already do. And I'd like to see that for Islam. I think Islam's got tons of years left. I think he's squarely in his prime. And up until he gets to 35 and starts to meet some of those curses that we know exist in our sport, I think, anything that he can do that's going to bring eyes, create traction, and create interesting moments for the UFC, they're going to be willing to do with Islam.
Very well said. So I think we're both leaning towards Arman being the rightful next fight for Islam Makhachev.
Yeah, Arman's number one, and they're very much on a parallel course, right? They started fighting each other in the UFC, and now they've both had a lot of wins, a lot of grappling, and most of the time they were winning by decision early on. But now they're both finishers. They're always looking for their finish, whether it's on the feet or on the ground. They're really good everywhere. They met once in their career, and they've kind of had a train track of careers past as far as both of their directions towards the belt have gone. But I think this thing comes around full circle. I think Arman gets the next title shot, and I think it's a very interesting fight, a whole lot different and even more competitive than their first one.
I totally agree.